leadership program. I lived on this small commune for a year. And back then, my program was funded by the government, and we went and met this organization and kind of talked about the realities of their service. Since then, 10 years have passed, and a lot has changed in the climate back home. And some of you might not be aware, but internally in Israel, they are considered a very contentious organization for all sorts of reasons, which we can talk about, and I'm sure Murphy will gladly explain. But we wanted to bring them to SIPA because this is the place to talk about contentious issues, and SIPA is beautiful because we have events on homosexuality in India. We have Latin American, the Cuban president, ambassador right next door, and we kind of bring all these issues to the table, and we don't discriminate one way or the other. So even though some might deem this as a specific attack on one thing or another, it's not. It's a conversation that we want to have with all you guys, hear from Israeli veterans. I'm sure Murphy will explain a little bit more about the organization, so I'll be sure to stop talking, but we thank you guys so much for being here, and please do respect our speaker. She's going to speak for the first part of this event. Then we'll take a little pause and let people need to leave to class at 2, and then we'll kind of move into more of a Q&A and discussion, and really hope that this is all fruitful for all of us. So thank you so much for being here as well.
So first of all, thank you so much, Gabrielle, for doing this. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see so much turnout. So my name is Murphy. I'm here with Breaking the Silenace, an organization of veteran soldiers, Israeli soldiers who served in the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Since 2000, the beginning of the Second Intifada, the Second Palestinian Uprising. And the heart of our work circles around collecting testimonies of soldiers who describe the day-to-day reality in the occupied territories. And together with these testimonies, we want to bring this conversation to the public, to have a conversation about the moral costs of this occupation. So as a group, we call for an end to the occupation. We demand a change in policy. It's not simply for archive purposes. We have a demand from our society and from the international community as well. But I think that first, in order to reach that point, we need to immerse ourselves in the facts and in the realities. And we hope that as former soldiers, we can shed light on some of that that is taking place in both the West Bank and in Gaza. So I'll start by introducing myself briefly, just a little bit more, sort of where I come from and how I entered this work. Hopefully through sharing specific experiences and testimonies of myself and other soldiers, and try to give a little bit of a bigger picture analysis of sort of what's happening today in the West Bank. So I, similar actually to Gabriella, I also grew up in Jerusalem. My parents are Canadian, if you're wondering about the accent. I was born and raised to a modern Orthodox family, so I don't know how much you know about Israeli society today, but mandatory service in the military services is mandatory, 2 years for women and 3 years for men. But there are many groups that don't actually serve or do time in the military. If you're a religious woman and ultra-Orthodox male, there's different sectors of society that abstain from service. So it was actually not something that was expected from me, or wasn't really sort of how my path was written out. But I did, at the time during high school, really think of the military as my best way to serve my country and sort of the highest form of contribution to my community. And as you may know, serving in the Israeli military, I think, really takes up a large place in many people's lives and sort of our identity. And at the time, I had learned a little bit about the occupation and about what's going on in the West Bank. I'd gone on educational tours and really had very, very lucky opportunities to get to know this reality, because it's not something that, as an average Israeli, you're exposed to whatsoever. And similar to Gabriella, I didn't know this about you, but I also attended a pre-military academy, essentially a leadership program that is aimed to create leadership roles within the military and also afterwards with an aim towards civil society in Israel. I did 2 years of service in the civil administration in the Nablus region. Nablus is one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank. And the civil administration is not a civilian body, it's a military unit to all intents and purposes. And it's essentially the behind the scenes of this military occupation, a military regime that is controlling the lives of Palestinians. I'll wait for some folks to sit down.
There's seats here in the center. You can
So the civil administration is essentially sort of the bureaucracy of this military regime that is controlling the lives of millions of Palestinians, the civilian population, for this year, 51 years and counting. And so things that you and I kind of consider things that happen in the public sphere run by our democratic systems and institutions and authorities in the West Bank are governed by Israeli soldiers. So my specific role was in an operations room between 2013 and 2015, in an operations room as part of the civil administration, specifically in the area of Nablus. Let's see if I know how to use this. No, I don't. There we go. Just to kind of, this is what I looked like not so long ago. I was towards the middle end of my service, so that's why I'm really excited. Two of my close friends in the base where we serve the headquarters of the Nablus region. And I have to say that, you know, there are many reasons that one gives testimony, breaks the silence. Each and every one of us come from a different perspective, different experiences. It could be that combat soldier who's armed head to toe standing at a checkpoint. And it could also be the sort of bureaucratic and gray, but I don't think any less important as part of what compiles the occupation and what makes it a reality every day. So some of the things that we dealt with on a daily basis in the operations room during a 12-hour shift is basically managing all of civilian life in that region. So say there's a car accident between a Palestinian and a settler on one of the main central roads in the West Bank in our region. We have to call the Israeli police, the Palestinian police, an Israeli ambulance, and Palestinian ambulance. If any one of those people are injured, they're going to be taken to separate hospitals, one inside Israel, one in Nablus. The whole vast regime of permits that I'll, I think, talk about later on, Palestinians' access into Israel for work or to visit family or to get urgent medical care that they cannot get within the West Bank is run and managed through a very tight system of permits in which soldiers also are doing their 2-3 years of mandatory service, issuing these permits or not issuing them according to the criteria. And part of what I specifically was exposed to throughout my service, throughout my time in Nablus, was the violent realities between Palestinians and settlers. The city of Nablus is in the top center part of the West Bank, surrounded by Israeli settlements and illegal outposts, and most of which are religious and Orthodox settlements, sort of ideological settlements, not just suburbia of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. And that's oftentimes where a lot of the extremist violence is, in these points of friction between ideological hardcore settlements and Palestinian, mostly agricultural villages. The types of things that would come up, which really were sort of mundane almost, were stone throwing of kids. Palestinians and Israelis both do that, but I was exposed to a very different reality when this sort of violence would happen from the Israeli side. So it could be that sort of daily thing, like children who are standing outside the intersection throwing stones. And it could be some of the more severe incidents of cutting down an olive grove or desecrating a mosque, or these types of what in the States you would call hate crimes. In Israel we call them, there's a nice euphemism which is called price tag attacks, which is essentially a nice way to say Israeli terrorism in this case. And so a lot of what I was exposed to was this violence coming from my community, in a sense. I was raised, as I said, in a sort of deep in the religious community, somewhere in between, I would say, more of the settler religious community and the ultra-Orthodox community. And even though I knew this phenomena existed, and I went into the West Bank with this sort of notion that okay, there is occupation, things are not the way they should be, but I'm going to be that good soldier. I'm going to work on my Arabic skills, I'm going to be nice to the people that I'm encountering, but I didn't really understand the scope of this phenomena of what we call settler violence. But more than that, I think, is the issue of a lack of law enforcement on these violent settlers and these incidents. It was sort of a reflection of the things that specifically my community doesn't want to address. And oftentimes this violence would happen on Shabbat, Friday, Saturday, the Sabbath, which is, if you're an Orthodox Jew, a day in which you don't do any sort of labor, you don't use electricity, you don't use your phone, you definitely do not pick up a stone or a stick or anything that can resemble labor. And what I was exposed to throughout my service was basically a community that doesn't have those same red lines. As I thought, were essential and were very basic. It could be Friday evening, 8 o'clock in the evening, I'm doing a day shift, and we get a phone call from soldiers who are guarding outside one of the settlements in the north region of Annapolis. And they see young children from the settlement throwing stones. It was Friday night after Shabbat dinner. And we wait for the police, because as soldiers, they're not actually supposed to or allowed to enforce the law on those Israeli civilians. And the police doesn't show up for about 30 minutes until eventually I get a report back saying that the soldiers, the children apologized and the soldiers sent them home. So that's a very different outcome for Palestinian children who are caught throwing stones in the West Bank, who could easily find themselves in weeks of trying to manage the military court system, possibly sit in military prison for a few months, or their parents will have to pay a very high bail to get them out. But it's also, much more severe incidents, as I was referring to, 2 o'clock in the morning, also Friday night, I'm doing a night shift, and we get a phone call from a Palestinian farmer who, in the village of Jalud, in the south of the region, he hears the sound of a chainsaw in his backyard. A few soldiers go out there and they start searching the area, and they find a settler with a chainsaw cutting down olive trees.
Sorry, Murphy. I'm so sorry, guys. We just do have a fire hazard issue, so I'm going to ask a few people from the outskirts to come in here. I know you don't want to be disruptive, but just so
Not like a real.
No, sorry, like to avoid a fire hazard. Oh. Brave souls, guys. It's not that hard. Maybe the people standing by the door there, could you just please come inside? And if needed, we'll stop at 2 and let you go to class, don't worry.
Here we go.
It's nice.
Amazing how those seats are so ostracized.